In a quiet corner of a forgotten shelter, where the hum of electricity whispers louder than any heartbeat, an old soul lies hidden behind steel bars and faded signage. She is a creature of the wild, a bobcat, but the forest no longer lives in her eyes. At 8 years old, her spirit has withered in silence. Her paws no longer remember the rhythm of stone and soil. Her breath comes soft and slow, as if she's trying not to be seen, or worse, not to exist. To most who pass by her enclosure, she is just another failed case, a body too broken, a mind too distant, the kind of animal whose story ends not with freedom, but with paperwork and a quiet closing of the file. But every once in a rare while, fate stirs in the stillness. A thread once thought severed begins to hum again. And sometimes, one wounded being calls silently across time and distance to another, not with sound, but with ache. This is the story of a creature nearly forgotten, and a man who had tried to forget everything. He was once a healer of the wild, a scholar of its shadows and its sounds. But grief had carved him hollow, and he had walked away from the very world that once gave him life, until the day he saw her photo. Just one photo, and something ancient and fragile inside him woke up. What follows is not just a rescue, but a remembering of who she was, of who he used to be, and of the sacred unspoken bond that can rise from the ashes when two broken souls meet in the quiet wilderness between sorrow and hope. In the dim afternoon light of the shelter, Nova lay like a stone smoothed by years of unseen storms. Her enclosure was clean, her bedding fresh, but nothing in it bore the scent of the life she once knew. The air was sterile, touched only faintly by pine disinfectant and distant birdsong piped in from an old speaker. Volunteers moved with quiet compassion, yet even they had stopped calling her name. The bobcat remained curled into herself, a coil of faded fur and forgotten fire. Her once golden eyes stared past the walls, past the humans, past the days that rose and fell without meaning. She had not eaten in 3 days, not since the last failed attempt at engagement, when a handler tried to entice her with feathers tied to a stick. Nova had simply blinked, slowly, as if to say, "That belongs to a world I no longer believe in." Far beyond the town's edge, in a house half swallowed by forest and fog, Jonas lived like a ghost among the trees. The windows of his old cottage reflected only branches and the occasional deer trail. No photographs remained on the shelves. He had packed them away long ago, along with the field notebooks, the research awards, and the stories of a man once called brilliant. Grief had thinned him, not in body, but in spirit. Since the accident that took his wife Lauren, he had spoken mostly to wind and silence. Mornings were spent walking without direction. Nights arrived with the sound of owls and memories too loud to bear. He had stopped checking his emails months ago, until that morning, when the image of Nova surfaced on his screen. It was not just the animal's posture that struck him, but the eyes, dim but deep, distant but waiting. Something in her still listened for a language the world had forgotten. Jonas arrived at the shelter without fanfare, stepping from his dusty truck with the hesitance of someone re-entering a church after a long absence. The receptionist asked no questions. There was something in his face that made people quiet. Sarah, the shelter director, offered him the file, but he waved it off. "Just let me see her," he said softly, voice rough from disuse. He approached Nova's enclosure slowly, almost reverently, as if crossing a sacred threshold. She didn't lift her head, but her ears moved, just barely. A flicker, a pulse. Jonas sat down cross-legged on the concrete floor and said nothing. The clock on the far wall ticked softly. A fly buzzed against the fluorescent light. He didn't try to speak, didn't try to coax her. He simply was, present, unmoving, listening to something no one else could hear. The first day passed without motion, but on the second, as Jonas returned and settled in once more, Nova did something strange. She shifted, just a little, enough for one paw to stretch across the bedding toward the cage mesh, closer to the man who never asked anything of her. Jonas noticed but didn't react. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, letting the smell of aged straw and rust and something faintly wild wrap around him like a memory. He stayed that way for hours, letting his body speak the patience his voice could not. When Nova rose, slowly, stiffly, to drink water before retreating again to her corner, it felt like a crack had opened in the frost of long winter. Small, quiet, but real. That night, Jonas dreamed of the forest trail where he and Lauren used to track bobcats. He could smell the damp moss, feel the morning fog settle in his lungs. He woke before dawn. Covered in sweat, the image of Nova's eyes burned into the backs of his lids. He remembered what it meant to read their signs, the scratch marks on tree bark, the resting depressions in long grass, the scent trails woven like threads through pine and dust. He had once written that bobcats speak in stillness, that their pain echoes in silence. Nova was speaking, he knew it now. She was not gone, just forgotten. Like him. Over the next few days, Jonas began bringing small offerings, pine cones, pieces of river stone, soaked moss from a nearby grove, items that once belonged to her world, now placed quietly near the enclosure. Nova sniffed them tentatively. Each day she inched closer. Her movements were slow, almost reluctant, as though memory weighed down her limbs. But something was awakening, not fast, not loud, but deep. Her body remembered what her mind had long buried, the sound of leaves underfoot, the scent of prey in the wind, the taste of wild air. In her presence, Jonas found fragments of himself returning too. Not the scientist, not the speaker at conferences, but the man who once sat for hours beneath trees, waiting for a glimpse of beauty that didn't need to be explained. One afternoon, as the sun slanted gold through the high windows, Nova did something she hadn't done in nearly a year. She groomed herself. Slowly, deliberately, her tongue moved across her foreleg, smoothing fur that had gone coarse with neglect. Jonas watched, breath catching in his chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes welled with something he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Not loud or triumphant, but fragile and sacred. As if the universe had reached out one hand through fur and silence and scars and whispered, "You are not lost, not yet." The days bled together like watercolor on soft paper. Pale dawns, quiet middays, dusky golds falling into long blue evenings. Nova and Jonas fell into a rhythm, not built of commands or routines, but of breathing, watching, waiting. There were no tricks, no conditioned responses. Instead, Jonas sat across from her, sometimes with closed eyes, sometimes tracing slow circles in the dirt with a twig. He brought no tools, no tablets, no theories, just presence, stillness. The kind of presence that doesn't seek to fix, only to witness. And Nova, the once wild ghost, began to emerge from her silence not in leaps, but in barely there movements. A twitch of her ears toward his cough, a slow blink when he arrived, a deeper exhale when he didn't speak. Jonas began humming, not songs, but tones, deep vibrating notes like wind moving through a canyon. He didn't plan it. The sound just came, instinctual, like a remembering of something primal. The first time he did it, Nova stood up, not out of fear, but in curiosity. Her tail flicked once. She walked to the edge of the enclosure, pressed her nose to the air, and breathed in. That vibration. It was like the call of the old world, a world she hadn't seen since she was a cub, when her mother vanished and she was taken by men with tranquilizers and gloves that didn't smell like earth. Now, here was a human who sounded like stone and wind and stillness. Something inside her stirred, not yet trust, but its fragile seed. Some evenings, Jonas scattered leaves on the concrete just outside her enclosure. Autumn crisp, coppery things from the grove near his cabin. He placed them in quiet spirals, mimicking the ancient patterns found in nature. The curl of a fern, the loop of a hawk's glide, the helix of unfurling bark. Nova would watch. At first, she didn't approach, but over time, she began to sniff them, even paw gently at their edges. One night, she lay down right in the center of one of the spirals, her body curved like a crescent moon. Jonas, watching from a distance, felt something shift in his chest. Not a breaking, a mending. Small, sacred, unseen. On the 7th week, a light rain began to fall during his visit. Most handlers would have canceled their sessions, but Jonas simply moved outside her enclosure and sat under the drizzle, his jacket slowly darkening. He tilted his face toward the sky, let the drops hit his eyelids. Nova watched him for nearly an hour. Then, something unprecedented. She walked up to the mesh, sat facing him, and lifted her face to the sky too. Together, they sat in parallel stillness, letting the earth weep over them. It was not communication in the way science would define, but it was communion. Something passed between them, quiet and raw and entirely real. Jonas began to speak to her, but not in sentences, just single words. Wind, river, stone, words from the language of wild things. He did not expect her to understand, but he said them as offerings, like leaves at a shrine. And sometimes Nova would respond, not with sounds, but with her body. A glance, a stretch, a momentary crouch. She was becoming a creature of response again, not merely reaction. She was remembering how to and be listened to. As winter approached, the air turned sharper, more fragrant with cedar and cold. Nova's coat grew thicker, her gait stronger. Jonas began introducing the sounds of her ancestral world, recorded rustlings of the forest floor, the call of distant coyotes, the whisper of a wind passing through high grass. He played them softly, always while sitting beside her, and Nova, little by little, began to move in rhythm with those echoes. She paced, she crouched, she watched the horizon painted on the far wall of her enclosure as though she could see beyond it. The shelter noticed, the staff remarked on her revival, but they didn't understand. They saw progress. Jonas saw resurrection. One day, Nova did something that broke the dam inside Jonas entirely. She chuffed. A low, breathy exhale, barely audible, but unmistakably meant for him. A bobcat's gesture of familiarity, of kinship. It lasted a second, but it landed like thunder. Jonas placed his hand on the floor, palm flat, fingers still. Nova approached, not all the way, but close enough for her whiskers to twitch in his scent. He did not move. His throat ached from the tears he refused to let fall. In that quiet moment, neither scarred soul needed to be fixed. They only needed to be known, and now they were. Winter loosened its hold slowly, reluctantly. Snow gave way to thawed earth, and the sun returned with that ancient golden persistence. Not bold, but steady, like something sacred reclaiming its space. Jonas stood beside the enclosure one early morning, the mist curling low across the sanctuary's meadows, like breath held in a hush. Nova was awake before him, pacing softly, her movements neither restless nor confined. Something in her eyes had changed. They no longer looked for escape, but beyond. Jonas knew the moment had arrived, not by a schedule or plan, but by the silence between them. It was time to go home, not his, but hers. The staff at the sanctuary had reservations. She'd been in captivity too long, they argued. The wild could be cruel. But Jonas didn't listen to doubts. He listened to instinct. The same instinct that had carried him here after the fire took everything. His research, his team, his reason for returning to the world. He had once studied the wild as data. Now, he moved through it as prayer. Nova was ready, not because she was perfect, but because she had remembered who she was. And Jonas, after all this time, had remembered who he was too. Not a man of accolades, but of listening, of reverence. They drove through mountain passes where the road curved like a river of dark stone, lined by trees whispering their endless hymns. Nova sat in a crate, not caged but protected, and the landscape unfolded like memory. Pines, streams, sky broken by eagle wings. Jonas barely spoke, but his hands gripped the steering wheel as if holding the edge of something sacred. Each mile closer to her birthplace, a stretch of unclaimed forest nestled against forgotten highlands, felt like shedding a skin. The past didn't vanish, but it softened. The road did not take them back. It carried them forward into something older than both of them. When they arrived, dawn was just kissing the horizon with that soft apricot hue only spring mornings carry. Jonas unlocked the crate slowly, the hinges clicking like bells in a cathedral. Nova didn't leap out. She stepped into the wild like one returning to sacred ground. The earth received her pause with a hush. Her body lowered instinctively, sniffing the wind, her ears dancing toward distant rustlings. Jonas watched, unmoving. A few feet away, a lone hawk circled above, as if summoned to witness. The forest did not celebrate her return. It accepted it, quietly, wholly, as though she had never left. For hours she did not leave the edge of the clearing. She walked in slow circles, pressing her scent into the earth, rubbing her face against trees, reclaiming her name in the language of bark and stone. Jonas sat nearby, his breath sinking with the trees. He knew she might not come back. That was not sorrow, that was the point. The bond between them was never meant to be ownership. It was an agreement, silent and ancient. I will walk beside you until you remember your path. And now she had. At dusk, Nova climbed a moss-slicked rise and paused at its peak, her silhouette framed against a sky painted in violet and indigo. She looked back. Not long, just a glance, enough to thread something invisible between them, a final thread of recognition. Not goodbye, not even thanks, just truth. And then, she vanished into the trees, her movement silent, elegant, real. Jonas remained on the ridge for hours, watching the place where she disappeared. He did not cry, he simply breathed. The wind carried the scent of pine and old rivers. Somewhere deep in the forest, a bobcat chuffed, and the night began. Days passed before Jonas packed his things. He wandered the highlands a while, not searching for her.